Good evening, sleepless wanderer. Or maybe it is still the afternoon where you are. Time zones make everything feel like a collective fever dream. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where history's most uncomfortable moments are somehow the perfect lullaby. Tonight, we are tackling a classic. Another long, mildly disastrous workday in ancient Rome. Spoiler alert, their mornings were just as painful as yours, but with more questionable plumbing. Before we leap straight into the chaos, if your idea of a good night is listening to someone gently complain about ancient suffering, go ahead and click whatever button tells the internet you like this. Maybe even subscribe. I promise we are more fun than most documentaries. Tell me your local time and where you are watching. I am convinced every country has its own way of dreading tomorrow. So dim your lights, wrap yourself in whatever blanket you can justify, maybe top off your glass. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now pretend you are not in your own bed, which, even at its worst, probably still has something resembling a mattress. No, tonight you get to wake on a lumpy sack stuffed with straw, possibly shared with a snoring relative who has claimed the only flat side. The early morning air does not exactly whisper you awake. It is more of a group effort. One goose honking in the alley, a neighbor dropping a chamber pot out the window, and somewhere very close by, a rooster who has read absolutely nothing about personal space. There is no snooze button. You could try covering your head with a bit of your cloak, but then your feet freeze because blankets here are always 2 inches too short. Your first groggy thought, why is everyone shouting before sunrise? Your second, how did it get so cold in a city that claims to be civilized? The floor is gritty. There is always sand or dust, finding its way through cracks or tracking in on tired feet. You stand and instantly regret moving. Your back sounds like old pottery, and your neck protests every attempt at pretending to stretch. Around you, the room is dim and stale. Candle wax, sweat, and yesterday's garlic drift through the air. The only thing steaming is not your coffee. It is your neighbor's laundry, halfway dry on the communal line hanging above your head. If you are unlucky, some laundry will fall onto your face, blessing you with the sharp aroma of used tunic. You stumble to whatever passes for a window. No double glazing here. You have a wooden shutter that barely keeps out noise or the dawn chill. Sunlight leaks in sideways, showing off the layer of grime you have made peace with. Outside, commerce is already erupting. Stall keepers shouting, donkeys making unidentifiable groans, a stray dog barking at something invisible. Every sound echoes like your own personal wake-up call, relentless and somehow wetter than you expected. You look for a cup of something hot and strong, but the closest you will get is lukewarm barley water that tastes suspiciously like last week's disappointment. There are no blackout curtains. There is no coffee maker humming in gentle anticipation. No cheerful radio voices, unless you count the old man across the alley bellowing about the state of his sandals. You try washing your face with water that is neither cold nor warm, just threatening. It smells faintly of last night's fish. Your hands are already grimy again by the time you finish. Everyone else in your home seems to be yelling for socks, bread, or for you to hurry up and get outside. For a brief, desperate moment, you wish for an alarm tone that sounds like gentle rain, or, at this point, like absolutely nothing at all. You sit on the edge of the bed, such as it is, and think about central heating. Not because you have it, nobody does, but just to torture yourself with the idea. Your toes are numb. Your lower back feels like it owes you a long explanation, and the day has not even started. You wonder how people survived without proper pillows, and then you remember they just got used to being tired all the time. You start to feel a grudging respect for your present-day mattress, and possibly even your neighbor's 6 a.m. lawnmower. Meanwhile, life outside keeps getting louder. Every knock, every animal noise pushes you toward the inevitable. Another overworked day. You take one last longing look at your stone-hard pillow, already missing it, even though you spent the whole night arguing with it. Outside your little room, Rome is waking up, and it will not do so quietly or gently, not for you, not for anyone. So you stand up again and get ready for whatever passes for morning cheer in a city that never really sleeps in. Dragging your still grumbling self outside, you brace for round 2, the morning migration to the communal latrine. It is not a glamorous trek, but it is a necessity. Every corner you turn, the crowd thickens. You can tell who slept poorly by the way they scowl at stepping in last night's puddle, or whose tunic has not survived the night without a questionable new mark. Coffee, breath, and bedhead are not really issues. Here, everyone is just trying not to breathe too deeply. The smell hits before you even round the final corner. It is something between wet masonry, old onions, and memories you have tried to repress. There are no scent diffusers, no cheerful little sprays. Instead, a nice, ripe combination of everything the city has processed for the last week, thanks to the unique Roman approach to shared plumbing. You find your way in, dodging elbows and pointed sneers from neighbors who managed to snag a better spot in line. Every step brings a new sensation to the soles of your feet. Cool, occasionally sticky, always a gamble. If you hoped for privacy, the joke is definitely on you. Today's bathroom is a long stone bench with well-worn holes and even more well-worn gossip. Every age, every walk of life, traders, bakers, children already shrieking, old men who are up in time, just to remind you of how slow they have become. The seat itself is smooth, cold, and as inviting as a marble gravestone. People glance up and down, measuring which spot might still be considered fresh. You pause, considering whether the extra sunlight streaming through the open arch makes it more pleasant, or just lets you see the stains more clearly. You sit, you sigh. You try not to think about the person to your left humming as he goes about his business, or the one to your right who is clearly in no rush at all. Conversation happens whether you are interested or not. Someone complains about the market. Someone else gossips about the neighbor who skipped cleaning duty. Somewhere, a small argument breaks out over whose turn it is to fetch the communal cleaning sponge, the infamous sponge on a stick, for those whose imagination dared hope for toilet paper. Today, the sponge sits in a bucket of vinegar water, its history older than your own memory can handle. At this point, your mind wanders to modern plumbing. Warm running water, flickering lights, maybe even a lock on the door. Around here, the only way you know it is your turn to use the sponge is if no one else is grabbing for it. You may as well check if you remembered to pack your humility. There is no soap. There is no quiet. Just the low murmur of conversation, a little forced laughter, and the gentle reminder that bacteria are having as lively a morning as you are. You glance at the wall and notice scribbled messages from past visitors. Some are crude drawings, others are complaints about the quality of the seat or the lousiness of the sponge. There is even a crude joke about gladiators, proof that bathroom humor predates the internet by quite a bit. You try to keep your robes from touching the floor. You try not to imagine what is on the floor. Your neighbor starts in on his favorite story, which is both louder and longer than you need at this hour. Latrine politics are an unspoken language. The prime seats are hotly contested, and you find yourself half listening for when someone gets up, so you can slide over to one that is less sticky, more shaded, or just farther from the loudest gossip. There is a subtle hustle, a shuffle here, a strategic cough there, all in pursuit of comfort that is not coming. If someone makes eye contact, you look away. You do not want to talk about the weather, not here. Eventually, when your business is finished, you stand and stretch, immediately aware of how the cold has worked its way through your knees. You marvel at modern bathrooms for a moment, bright, warm, silent, except for a fan you can ignore. You make a note to be extra grateful next time you use soft toilet paper and shut the door behind you. Here, in Rome, privacy is a myth and dignity is optional. You return the sponge to its bucket and wash your hands in a trickle of water that leaves as many questions as answers. The morning ordeal is complete. You have survived another rush hour at the communal latrine, overheard a few secrets, sacrificed another little piece of your pride, and stepped out feeling slightly more alive. Not cleaner, but alive. Time to face the real work of the day, though honestly, you have already done enough. You finally stagger back inside, expecting, if not hope, at least a little reward for surviving the bathroom games. But here in Rome, breakfast is an exercise in lowered expectations. Your morning meal has been planned to deliver exactly enough energy for another day of mediocrity. In front of you, bread, not the springy, golden type that crackles under a knife. This is bread that doubles as a doorstop. If you are lucky, it is only a day or two old, crust so hard it actually warns your teeth, crumb as dense as a philosopher in the Forum. You take your first bite, and the bread fights back. It absorbs every drop of spit like it is on a mission. The air smells faintly yeasty, almost friendly, but only until you realize there is no butter, no honey, not even a splash of olive oil unless you are feeling reckless. Figs make rare cameos. If you see one, you know somebody pulled strings or robbed a child. Maybe, just maybe, there is a smear of something that once resembled cheese. More often, there is dry bread, and if you are especially fortunate, a bowl of thin barley porridge to round out the beige palette. No orange juice here. No carefully roasted coffee wafting through the house. No glossy magazine eggs poached with loving attention. Definitely no avocado. There is no breakfast playlist either, just more street noise and a distant argument about taxes. You glance at your meal and wonder what a modern food influencer would make of this thoroughly uninspired tableau. Probably a slow-motion video of dust flying off the crust, paired with an earnest post about rustic authenticity. Nobody is taking enough photos of this to sell it. You gnaw your way through breakfast, hoping your jaw does not give out before your patience does. There is no pleasure, just sustenance. Every chew reminds you that comfort food is not really a concept here. Calories, though, they are the top priority, and bread always shows up for roll call even when nobody asked it to. You finish, not satisfied, but at least less hungry than you were 5 minutes ago. You might catch yourself dreaming of soft muffins or even cereal that does not need to be hacked apart with a knife. You might imagine brunch, shiny cutlery, heaps of fruit, mountains of fluffy pancakes. Here, brunch is not a word. Here, you get more bread. And you eat it, because the day is long and there is work waiting outside. At best, you might wash it down with a mouthful of yesterday's wine or that mysterious barley drink, neither of which will ever trend anywhere. The meal disappears, just like your illusions of a cozy start. Sustenance, nothing more. The crowd outside is getting louder, work is already calling, and you are now fortified by the breakfast of champions, or at least the breakfast of survivors. Once you have swallowed the last stubborn chunk of bread, it is time to join the moving mass outside. Off to work, not so much with spring in your step as with a sense of duty in your sandals. Speaking of sandals, these are not modern ergonomic marvels. They are straps and thin soles, doing their best to keep the city from winning any toe versus cobblestone matchups. Forget cushy sneakers, forget any hope of arch support. The Roman commute is done the hard way, one uneven footfall at a time. The moment you step out, the city pulls you in. People flood the streets from every alley and stairwell, all trying to outrun the next hour. There is no gentle hum of engines, just a full-throated chorus of voices. Merchants hawking stale goods, street performers already mid-rant, gossip echoing around tight corners. You press forward and instantly lose all faith in the idea of personal space. Each breath tastes faintly of smoke, dung, or whatever was spilled on the paving stones an hour ago. Carts rattle by, pulled by donkeys who have clearly had enough of everyone. There is always that one cow blocking traffic, and chickens make regular cameo appearances underfoot. You dodge a puddle and immediately regret looking to see what made it. On one side, someone shouts offers for garum that probably expired during the last emperor's reign. On the other, a would-be poet tries to perform over the clatter of passing hooves. Overhead, the sun is already climbing, and so is the stench of a city that prefers action over sanitation. Walking to work here is competitive. It is body to body, cloak to cloak, with constant tactical shifts to avoid errant elbows, runaway baskets, or pickpockets looking for breakfast. You keep a hand near your belt, bad enough to lose your coin purse, worse to have to explain how you lost it. Every few steps, the crowd parts just enough to let someone hurry past, shouting apologies that sound more like insults. Sometimes you joke with strangers. Sometimes you swear quietly as a cart's axle sprays you with mud. You aim for the line between grudging resentment and a wink of solidarity. This is everyone's struggle, not just yours. Modern commuters love to compare traffic horrors, but a Roman street has its own flavor. Imagine a subway car stuffed to breaking with strangers, elbows and the odd live goat, except there are no steel rails, just stone, and sometimes a spontaneous parade, or a man selling miracle cures at the intersection. Momentum is everything. If you stop, you get bumped. If you slow, you get cursed. Still, nobody here is thrilled about the experience. Some mumble old jokes about the city never sleeping and never letting you nap, but nobody is smiling as they step into a fresh mound left by a passing mule. Not all hazards are strictly human. You are just as likely to get distracted by a lively puppet show in the forum as you are to be sideswiped by a fishmonger's barrel. Children dart through gaps, beggars appeal with practiced enthusiasm, and philosophers attempt to debate anyone who unfortunately makes eye contact. Resigned camaraderie grows out of minor misfortunes, A spilled sack of lentils becomes everyone's business. A toppled cart inspires a mini traffic conference. No one feels important here, but everyone is crucial in moving the city forward, inch by inch. Across it all, there is a certain rhythm, and not the pleasant kind. You grit your teeth and keep moving. You grumble about the same obstacles every day, but so does everyone else. Someone cracks a joke about the prospect of shoes with built-in cushions, and a dozen tired faces immediately look wistful. Your feet carry you through the muck and the crowd, and you realize, whether ancient or modern, nobody likes the morning commute. Some just have a better place to sit down when it is over. Eventually, the swarm splits off, and you wind up at the day's real destination, a Roman workplace, if that is what you want to call it. Whether you are headed to a smoky smithy, a clattering bakery, or a ledger-crammed back office, nobody is greeted by an ergonomic chair or a warm welcome. At best, you get a nod from someone too tired to pretend it is going to be a good day. If you are lucky, your work only leaves your muscles sore. Hauling amphory, stoking a roaring fire, or wrestling stubborn bundles from one dingy corner to another. If you are closer to the bottom rung, it is endurance with a side of creative grumbling. The jobs blur together: sweep, fetch, stack, repeat. There are never enough hands, always more orders, and the only thing management values is surviving until sundown. Mistakes earn a scowl. Speed earns silence. Praise is as common as a fresh laurel crown. You tuck away any hope of paid time off alongside all that unused ambition. Higher up, maybe you are stuck in accounting, cataloging every sack of grain with ink that smells like suffered regret, or recording the debts of neighbors who glare at your shorthand. Every number another pebble in this mountain of small resentments. The papyrus is scratchy, the stylus is worn, and every correction feels personal. If you fantasize about email, remember, complaints here are delivered in person, and they do not check their tone. Lunch break, only if you can eat with one hand and work with the other. Meals are rushed, fit in between tasks. Cold bread, stringy bits of cheese, hopes for something better next time. Nobody expects a quiet corner or a mindful moment with a drink topped up and legs stretched out. There are no birthday cakes, no surprise pizza, no sad leftovers microwaved with envy. Hours stretch and bend without much sense of progress. There is always another task waiting. You sweep, carry, count, mend, and haul your soul around as quietly as possible, blending sweat and patience in equal measure. Quotas are not numbers on a spreadsheet, but a pile that grows the more you look away. Swapping a joke with a coworker helps for a breath or two, but soon everyone slips back into routine. The rhythm, slow and methodical. If the job ends, it is only because the daylight does, or someone else starts shouting about the next thing. Sometimes you imagine a futuristic HR department, complete with wellness initiatives, ergonomic footrests, and friendly, utterly useless online surveys. Maybe someday, someone will invent a suggestion box that does not double as firewood. Back in reality, your only break comes when your supervisor looks away long enough for you to straighten your back and wonder, just briefly, what life would be like if work actually stayed at work. There is no such luck. You are always just one missed order or spilled jug away from a full rerun of your least favorite tasks. The best part of the day might be the quiet resignation you share with your peers. Nobody pretends this is dream work. Some pass the time humming tunelessly, Others pass around a slightly cleaner rag. You all make do. At least here, you do not have to pretend you have a 5-year plan. Getting through the next hour is accomplishment enough for now. The sun travels that slow, indifferent arc across the sky. The shadows stretch, and eventually, so do you. You have spent another day earning your crust, fighting fatigue that feels as old as Rome itself. No applause, no bonus, just the knowledge that you did not disappear under the weight of mundane expectation. The work never truly ends, but at least now, you can start thinking about escaping the grind until tomorrow rewinds it all again. When midday stumbles in, it brings no grand relief. Lunch is not so much a pause as a brief tactical retreat. You find yourself squeezing into a corner, knees aching and elbows already tangled with the next person's cloak. There is no peaceful hum of a break room, just the echo of hunger's low expectations. On offer today, more bread, naturally. Sometimes beans if fortune smiles, and perhaps a sliver of pickled vegetable, sharp enough to wake your tongue, just sour enough to remind you to be glad for anything different. It is all served cold and barely seasoned, the flavors neatly summarized as familiar, simple, and somewhere between tolerable and forgettable. Hard to wax poetic about a meal that would struggle to get a single star on any rating system, past or present. Lunch is eaten quickly. Room to sit is an earned luxury, so mostly you eat on your feet, trying not to spill beans on your tired sandals. Colleagues are close enough for you to hear every detail about their latest gripe. The loudest voice belongs to someone reliving their run-in with the boss before sunrise. Another is swearing they will never touch garum again, right before taking another cautious bite. The clamor forms its own background music, forkless, relentless, honest. Gone is the fantasy of a quiet table or polite conversation. Here, you trade comments and complaints with only the thinnest filter. Breathe too deeply, and you get a second helping of pickled onion fumes. Move too slowly, and you will lose what little food you managed to claim. Occasionally, someone pulls out an actual treat, maybe some dried fruit, and suddenly it is a minor spectacle. The rest of you try not to stare, but you would trade a week's worth of beans for one bite. Modern lunch culture loves its soft seating and endless drink choices. It loves the lunchtime scroll, the ceremonial unboxing of a sad desk salad, and the gentle glow of a microwave humming in the background. In Rome, there is no hum, just the overlapping rhythms of chewing, bickering, and the whack of a stray elbow. You finish before you have properly started, tucking that last stubborn bit of bread into your mouth in time to dodge a coworker's vague invitation to swap chores. There is not much to linger for. The food will not improve with conversation. But there is comfort, in its own way, in the routine. Everyone is here for the same reason. Everyone is just as unimpressed with the cuisine. Gossip floats through the air. Who is late? Who is angling for the easier task? Who is convinced they saw a senator in a back alley buying cheap wine? Lunch here is nutrition and news, nothing more. The bread is dry, but the jokes keep coming, and the time passes if you do not watch the clock too closely. By the end, you are not full, just slightly less empty, so you wipe your hands on your tunic, because why not, and press back into the next round, fortified not by flavor, but by the knowledge that you are sharing this with others, for better or worse. The break is finished before anyone had a chance to miss it. Lunch hour, if you want to call it that, comes and goes so fast. It is almost like it never happened at all. When the sun decides to test everyone's patience, it does so with Roman determination. Mid-afternoon hits, and already your tunic clings in ways that were never part of the design. Sweaty at the neck, sticky at the waist, itchy everywhere, the heat radiates from the stones underfoot, rising up your legs and daring you to complain. You will, of course, but quietly. The whole city seems to shimmer, letting the dust move even when nobody else feels like it. You lean back for a moment, if the boss is not watching, and try to catch a shadow that has not already been claimed. Someone fans themselves half-heartedly with a chipped scrap of pottery. Another shares, with the confidence of a seasoned liar, that they have heard a passing cart was carrying cool water jugs straight from the mountains. Nobody believes it, but everyone wants to. The best you can manage is a sip of warm barley drink that only makes your mouth stickier. There is no breeze, but there is plenty of air, thick, dust-laden, flavored with the day's labor. Feet ache in shoes that never promised comfort. Your back dares you to straighten up. Your shoulders threaten revolt. You tune out for a few precious seconds, just listening. Around you, a constant stream of rumors, half-baked news from the forum, and that one story about someone's cousin's neighbor's donkey running off with a senator's cloak. Every workplace has its own rumor mill, but Rome's is louder and has zero filter. Gossip passes around like a communal snack. You pick up a bit here. Someone lost money on a dice game. Another fragment there. Someone swears they saw a famous gladiator sulking over burnt bread. The stories come rapid fire. No need for evidence, only delivery. It is the ancient world's version of scrolling for distraction, different names, same restless need to escape. No painted icons, but plenty of word-of-mouth drama. There is nowhere to hide from the heat, no retreat to iced drinks or flickering screens. Air conditioning is a fantasy, as exotic as flying chariots, and water comes only if you bribe the right person. You settle for dabbing your forehead with a corner of tunic and pretending it helps. The lot of you trade mainly on stamina and the knowledge that nobody is alone in their slow dissolve into late-day fatigue. Work in the afternoon moves by inertia. Everybody keeps finding small jobs just to keep from stopping. Someone trips over a trailing sandal. Someone else sighs at a fresh stain on their robe, looking around as if an apology might materialize. The pile of duties is still there, stubbornly the same no matter how much you sweat on it. If there is one comfort, it is the sense of communal misery. Everyone is sluggish. Everyone is counting the glare of sunlight on the wall, judging when it will finally tilt toward evening. The complaints pile up, but so do the shared jokes. You smirk at the sheer theater of it all, history's longest afternoon, kept alive by gossip, dust, and the pure stubbornness of bodies refusing to call it quits just yet. Eventually, the angle of the sun lets you pretend the workday might almost be done. You drag yourself away from whatever chore tried to claim your soul last, feet as unresponsive as the kitchen tap. On the way home, each step feels heavier. Back, legs, and brain all petitioning for early retirement, though nobody's granting it. Finishing work in Rome is not a clean break. No cheerful wave to a time clock. No clatter of office doors shutting out responsibility for another day. Clocking out means pivoting straight to round two. Errands, chores, second shifts called family obligations. Maybe you dodge a neighbor who corners you asking for help with water buckets. Maybe you are the one roped into hauling firewood that looks heavier the longer you stare at it. Dinner does not magically appear, either. Someone must haggle with a street vendor over onions wilting in solidarity. Home is not the peaceful sanctuary promised by self-care ads. It is a room as crowded as your day, brimming with siblings, and an aunt or two who always needs something. Children chase each other across stone floors, daring you to step in with last reserves of patience. There is laundry to move, a lamp to coax out one more night's glow from the stingy ration of oil, some sort of animal sniffing around for dropped crumbs. The words "me time" may not yet exist, but the concept is just as faint. Still, there are moments when exhaustion softens. Someone pulls out a battered set of knucklebones or a scrappy board for a quick game. Maybe you snag the least burnt crust from the dinner pot, or someone finds a sweet fig nobody noticed at breakfast. The lamp burns low, the shadows waver, tiny, ordinary luxuries earning outsized appreciation after a day like this. There is no streaming service offering 1,000 distractions. Instead, there is storytelling, gossip drawn out like a fading melody, a little laughter because there is nothing left to do but laugh. Of course, downtime is highly theoretical. Domestic duties fill each corner, stray sandals to repair, bread for tomorrow to patch together, laundry to wash with water that seems colder at sunset than it did at dawn. Someone needs your help, or your opinion, or, quite often, your willingness to just sit and listen. Privacy rarely survives. You multitask long before the word existed, fixing a sandal while picking over legumes, while fielding requests from across the room. But scraps of relief break through. Maybe you lean against a wall, a cup of sour wine in hand, letting the day's noise settle into a more bearable background hum. You nod at friends slipping past in the street, the city still pulsing just outside the shutter. In a rare moment, you might even drift off for a minute, eyes closed, not because the bed is soft, but because you are simply too tired to care. Rome's evenings are not restful, not in the modern sense. There are no scented candles, no plush couches, no mystery show ready to soak up your leftover attention. But there is routine, tasks finished, stories traded, tomorrow's bread set rising in a battered bowl. You sigh with the kind of satisfaction that only results from surviving the expected chaos. One more day filed away, one more stretch of regular discomfort endured, and the knowledge that, however little changed, you managed to laugh somewhere along the way. As darkness seeps in and chores finally slow, the city offers its own version of entertainment, never elegant, rarely private, always energetic. If you are lucky and have a bit of spare change, you might make your way toward the public baths. This is no spa day. It is hundreds of bodies packed into clouds of steam, laughter echoing off stone, the kind of heat that fogs every reasonable thought. Nobody is here for serenity. You jostle for space, dodging elbows and half-heard jokes, rinsing off a day's worth of sweat while pretending not to notice the questionable water. Relief, however brief, wins out over the smell. Others head for street corners, where performers juggle torches or put on mini tragedies with more shouting than acting. Children dart between adults, and the night buzzes with leftover energy. Laughter and arguments blend into a single rhythm, loud enough to make you forget the ache in your legs, at least until you try to sit down. For the truly ambitious, there are cheap games or dice with friends, a round of enthusiastic insults, or one singer who performs slightly out of tune. Entertainment in Rome is not about the show, but the shared escape from routine. Everyone crowds in, nobody pretends it is glamorous, but for a while, everyone is part of the same noisy theater. Privacy, as always, is a forgotten dream. Whether you are soaking in a communal pool or pressed shoulder to shoulder at a game, your business is everyone's business. The bath attendant makes pointed jokes about your sunburn. The crowd comments on the outcome of street wrestling matches or who just slipped in the mud. You smile because here, embarrassment is free and laughter is contagious. It is not so different from modern movie nights crammed onto a too small sofa, or a fitness class where nobody quite knows the steps, but everyone keeps moving anyway. You savor these fragments of fun, not because they are extravagant, but because they mark the end of another endless day. For now, you listen to raucous laughter or quietly cheer a friend's absurd victories. Evenings stretch on with cheap wine, stories retold for the 5th or 50th time, the comfort of belonging to a tired, noisy, utterly human crowd. The night eventually grows quiet, but you hang on to that last bit of relief, letting it soften the sharp edges of Roman life before tomorrow inevitably begins again. Eventually, the city's laughter fades into the low, familiar rumble of night. Bedtime, if you want to call it that, is less a ritual and more a negotiation between what your body wants and what the universe, or at least your landlord, is willing to provide. There are no pajamas, unless you count keeping the least itchy layer of the day. Privacy is a rumor, usually lost to a roomful of relatives, and the stubborn presence of someone who insists on humming right up until sleep. You claim whatever corner of the lumpy bed or squeaky mat still has a name tag with your sigh on it. The air is thick with the smell of everything the house has collected since morning. Someone cracks a window shutter to let in a sliver of breeze, which mostly lets in more noise. Street dogs, optimistic vendors trying one last pitch, the distant splash of water where neighbors argue about whose laundry is whose. You lie down, shifting through wayward lumps, and that one relentless spring poking your ribs, hoping the roof tiles stay where they are this time. Some evenings, you are serenaded by a loose shutter, or the bold scurrying of nighttime pests plotting just beneath your pillow. It is not a peaceful silence, but it is familiar, a soundtrack of home, if you choose not to listen too closely. The room glows softly, lit by a tired lamp, or just the moon leaking through chinks in the wall. You try not to think about tomorrow, though worries creep in anyway, as quietly as the cold. Will the bread stretch? Will the work pile be lighter? Will the weather stay dry? No use fretting now. Instead, you fidget, tangle your feet in the too short blanket, and replay the day's highlights in your head. Or lowlights, sometimes both. The ancient world's version of mindlessly scrolling a phone, cataloging every bad joke, annoying neighbor, and questionable business, again and again. Eventually, exhaustion wins out over discomfort or creeping insomnia. You sigh, grateful just to be horizontal, and send up a silent hope that the roof will hold, the walls will stay quiet, and the neighbors will snore on a different schedule tonight. It is not luxury, but it is a pause at the end of the marathon. The day is finally, blissfully, almost over, at least until the rooster starts his campaign in a few short hours, and you do it all over again. Lying there, with the roof stubbornly holding and the city finally quiet, it is hard not to marvel at how relentlessly ordinary survival used to be. Hours of sweat and routine just to earn a piece of stale bread and a story to share before lights out. Every century has its grumbles, Roman crowds, creaky beds, mystery meat at lunch. Ours just have better plumbing and a pause button for notifications. Tonight, maybe you notice the soft click of the thermostat or the glow of your phone with honest relief. The Wi-Fi works. The bathroom door does too. The taps run, the roof stays put, and somewhere within reach, an alarm is waiting, well-behaved and mostly optional. Ancient Rome's overworked days were a feat of spirit, but your version is not exactly effortless either. Still, there is something satisfying about not sharing a sponge on a stick or plotting your life around communal laundry. Tomorrow, when the alarm blares or you stand grumbling in line for your morning coffee, you could try being gently impressed by just how far humanity has come, or just hit snooze. That is a luxury even emperors never managed. Beneath the slanting gold of dawn, the royal palace of Dahomey stood, walls of laterite under silk blue sky, carved doors, absorbing the stories of hundreds of years. To the west, low drums pulsed through morning mist, their rhythm clinging to the air like the scent of cola and dust. Somewhere within that web of ochre courtyards and shaded alleys, a child named Akpata listened, the world blooming open through her wide, attentive eyes. She had come into the palace not by birthright, but by ancestral decree. As though the lives drifting before her, griots and tellers, memory keepers and singers, had braided her soul from the same stubborn thread her mother's mother had sung for King Gizo, and died in her sleep before the French set foot upon these lands. Her father, old even in Akpata's first memory, had carried a djembe taller than himself and whispered, "Ours is not a voice. Ours is the river where all voices meet." In the early years, Akpata's world was an endless spiral of sound. The slap of pestle in mortar, laughter from the girls' quarters, history chanted in the low vaults that circled the king's private rooms. In the Orison, the eternal house at the palace's heart, she learned to wait in the cool breath of stones, patient for the first notes that signaled another lesson. Her mentors called themselves Alohan, the bearers and shapers of breath. With every meeting, they pressed upon Akpata the secret that songs did more than entertain. They recorded, instructed, gave contour to time itself. A griot, they insisted, was the kingdom's flesh, the keeper of a spirit that would dissolve in silence if misremembered. Nights came soft and velvet dark, punctuated by lamplight glinting on calabash and the low stir of mosquito nets. Older griots would gather, circle around drums as if circling fire, humming before voice shaped the words. Akpata sat beside the oldest, Madame Effensetten, whose hands bore the scarred rings of one who had played both peace and mourning. "Listen, child," she would say, "for in every refrain there lives a witness. Songs remember what men's tongues would rather forget." So, Akpata learned the accounts of kings. Agaja, who conquered Oyo cities, Jays, who challenged the coastal fire, Behinzin, whose resistance was woven in tigers' teeth. But she also absorbed the spaces between, the sorrow and the song of the market woman, whose sons had vanished with the slave traders, the laughter that turned brittle at the edge of morning. These, too, were Dahomey. Each narrative entrusted to her tongue quickened her chest and kept her vigilant, as if words themselves were embers carried from the ruins of another age. Her afternoons passed beneath canopies of palm and kapok. The books of memory unfolded in the shade. Instructors led her through riddles and lamentations. The epic of Akaba, the parable of the python, and the moon. They chanted not just in Fon and Yoruba, but in the cadences of the long-lost Alada and Mahai. Akpata's task was not only to remember, but to inhabit every telling, every modulated breath. Her mentors demanded the precision of a blade, one word astray, one accent fallen wrong, and the meaning might crumble. She knew even then that she was an archive in the form of a girl. Sinew, marrow, spirit woven into the kingdom's chronicle. Yet, through the high walls and the flickering peace, an unease crept lately like the ache before rain. The elders, once many, had become few. On some nights their songs faltered, ending before they should, as if a line had unspooled and vanished in the humid air. The palace welcomed new faces, merchants from Porto Novo, messengers bearing foreign names, soldiers with boots that marked the ground as if to measure it. The king's own shadow seemed restless, stretching from council chamber to temple, returning each evening with new questions written on his brow. Akpata sensed the trembling at the edge of things. In the market, women still bartered palm oil and indigo. But sometimes, their stories snagged on memories of chains and ships moored at Uida's shore. She felt the gaze of the ancestors as she practiced her recitals at dusk. Their patience was not infinite. Yet when she sang, when her own voice joined the invisible current that circled the palace, she discovered joy difficult, stubborn, incandescent. The world narrowed to the span of her breath, every note a claim against being forgotten. In dreams, Akpata sometimes stood on a high red hill, looking down on a city half steeped in mist. She would turn, certain she was not alone. Someone always listened, a line of royal figures, their eyes at once grave and trusting, each waiting for her to begin again. As morning spilled across Dahomey, she woke determined, her ribs vibrating with the memory of ghostly applause. This was her inheritance and her charge. To be the last griot if destiny required it, to embroider her kingdom's memory into the silence that stalked it. Around her, Dahomey shifted and prepared for the coming of storms, but Akpata sang steadfast, her every note a promise that there would yet be an answer to oblivion. In the singing, the kingdom was still alive, the echo of the past refusing, stubbornly, to die. The palace stood at a slight remove from the turbulent heart of Abame streets, but every morning, Akpata crossed that gentle threshold, drawn to the marketplace, a pulsing stage where Dahomey negotiated its soul with every barter and boast. Beyond the carved gates, the city's arteries spread wide, lined with stalls canopied by faded cloth. Painters, weavers, sellers of carved ivory and amulets, the air strung with the bitter sweetness of cassava and the sharper tang of spice. Here, the stories that Akpata carried inward as song roamed outward, disguised as gossip or laughter, as if the dust itself could not help but remember. She moved among the traders, her feet bare, her small shadow trailing among the patterns trampled by horses and kings alike. It was here, among these jostling bodies, that Akpata learned a different tongue, the fractured, urgent language of a people thinking aloud. The griots whom she encountered smiled at her with knowing, toothless grins, a line of women, careful about their wares, careless only in their speech. They sold memory as easily as salt, packaging heartache in riddles, hiding lament behind bright proverbs tossed to the wind. Akpata leaned in to overhear, letting the market's polyphony enfold her. A fisherman's widow sang of her husband's long absence, work song turning to lament. Yet beneath each note ran a kind of coded hope. Elders laughed at the foot of the palm wine seller's stall, their jokes laced with warnings about the king's collectors, the mysterious men who came striding in uniform, asking too many questions. Above it all, children darted and tumbled, inventing folklore as they went. Today Dahomey balanced on a tortoise's back. Tomorrow it would swim on the spine of a crocodile. Traders from beyond the kingdom's rim wound through the crush, their words thick with distant places. Akpata heard of red-mouthed rivers and iron towns, of foreigners bargaining at Uida for more than palm oil. Names returned, sometimes in hushed syllables. Porto Novo, Lagos, the ever-approaching France with its hunger for land and meaning. These tales, barely louder than the shiver of market leaves, brushed Akpata's mind with knowing dread that a griot's work grew sharper as change approached, that one day she might be the only one left who recalled the old songs as more than an old woman's lullaby. It was in such moments, swirling in the undisciplined chorus of the market, that Akpata glimpsed how the fabric had begun to fray. The oldest sellers now wore worry behind their eyes, and none trusted a stranger who lingered by the slave pens. Old remains, silver coin appeared more often than cowrie shells. Scribes from the coast had set up stalls, pricking parchment with foreign script, where once stories passed mouth to ear, unbroken. The pace of change was stealthy, its breath both cool and relentless, yet irresistible as dawn. As day lengthened, Akpata would retreat to the shade of the kapok, its roots gnarled like ancient fingers curled in perpetual prayer. Children gathered about her, eager or restless, waiting for the moment she would begin. Her song was different here, less formal, gentler in rhythm, her voice braided with the laughter and interruptions, her words prismed by dust, by the ill-concealed sadness of mothers and the boredom of the young. In these gatherings, tales of Dahomey's queens became not marble effigies, but women of wit and quick temper. Generals leaped from legend into flawed, fleshly life. Smiles flickered, and even gossip gave way to awe as Akpata sang. Yet when the stories ended and applause melted into the heat, she often sat alone, listening not to voices, but to absence, the way the silence pressed against her skin when the market slowed, when old men closed their hands over some remembered grief. She felt gratitude for what still lived, and a growing sorrow for what was already fading, a phrase lost, a proverb replaced by something hollow and new. Her heart was trained to witness, her soul shaped in the crucible of remembering, but she discovered now that every day took something too. Some evenings, retreating from the market's waning clamor, Akpata returned to the palace laden less with goods than with stories newly acquired. Burdensome in their secretness, she would share fragments with Madame Effensetten, who sat cross-legged and ancient in her room lit with palm oil lamps, the flames catching on every wrinkle. Together, master and pupil sifted rumor from record, pondering how much of what the marketplace whispered should be allowed to enter the annals, and how much was only the first trembling of an uncertain future. For Akpata, these acts of curation were more than tradition. They were a wager, a slender bond spun between what Dahomey had been and what soon it might become. Outside, the dusk would settle slow as a benediction, painting the market zone in indigo and ochre. Akpata watched the day's residue sift into shadow, 1,000 lives, each a seam in a greater tapestry, each converging somewhere in her heart. She understood that her own fate was not only to safeguard the old stories, but also, quietly, to witness their transformation. The marketplace's echoes lingered in her dreams that night. Calls and retorts, laughter, the bracing discipline of change. Even when she could not sleep, Akpada was never alone, for entire generations waited in the bright hush of memory, waiting for her, as always, to record the moment before it turned into myth. In the pulse of midday, the palace seemed suspended, its courtyards awash in a slanting light that forgave no imperfection. Even the great statues and ancestral altars appeared to pause, breathless beneath skies bleached by the oncoming harmattan winds. Yet deep within these walls, a strangeness began to harden. The hush that crept over Dahomey was not the solemn stillness of veneration. It was edged, tight, as if each stone anticipated the shudder of distant thunder. Akpada, grown keener with each passing moon, recognized how quickly change could turn into rupture. There were new absences where elders once sat, seats vacant in the assembly hall, mourning recitations that faltered as names were left unspoken. Younger voices filled the air with irritation rather than curiosity. Training sessions, once robust with laughter and challenge, became sparse branches, each lesson brittle as dried grass, ready to snap beneath the weight of too much expectation. Rumors flickered at the periphery, tales of spies in the border towns, of foreign priests cataloging what they did not understand. Soldiers no longer marched only at festival or threat. Columns in foreign colors appeared at gates, their words heavy with meaning even when their speech was soft. The old advisors conferred in guarded tones, and undercurrents of dread seeped into every corridor, settling even in song. The king himself withdrew behind layers of ritual, public ceremonies, thick with incense and orchestrated cheer. Private moods, opaque to all but the most trusted. Akpada was called several times to perform for the inner court, but these were strained affairs, poised at the edge of morning, though no bell had rung. She sensed hope thinning, replaced by the twitching presence of uncertainty. Her songs required more effort now, as if each word must be pried from stone. At night, Dahomey's silence grew absolute. In the northern quarter, where drums once mapped out histories across the sky, only the breeze dared speak, passing ragged through branches. Akpada visited Madame Effensetten in her illness, bearing the old woman's favorite tales like offerings. She found her teacher diminished, her gaze cloudy, each word summoned slowly, as though memory itself had grown costly. They spoke quietly of loss. "One day," Effensetten rasped, "we become the stories we cannot finish. Do not let the silence win." Her hand gripped Akpada's, thin as carved horn, trembling with what must remain handed over. In that touch, Akpada felt an entire lineage passing, a pressure as gentle as regret and as immense as inheritance. Desperate to keep the river of culture from drying, Akpada carried her own burden into the palace's darkened storehouses. Among the scrolls and ritual objects the ancestors bequeathed to wary successors, she sang to her gathered memories, names, places, the cadence of morning rites, the teasing fragments of ancient riddles. She spoke them aloud to the idols, to the bones in enameled jars, to the painted histories etched in royal blue. She refused the stillness, clinging to her voice not as a shield, but as a slender bridge. The siege was not waged by armies alone. It was, more dangerously, a siege of time. Foreign scribes approached the king's court, scribbling Dahomey's secrets, as if the land's identity might be trapped in a ledger and transported overseas. A delegation from the north arrived with gifts of flintlock and velvet, their courtesies hiding a rapacious intent. The royal family debated. Some advised negotiation, others counseled resistance at any cost. As silence pressed against Dahomey's heart, Akpata recognized its deadly potential. The gradual erasure hidden within submission, the muting of memory by polite translation. Day after day, she persisted in her apprenticeship, correcting the youngest as they misremembered the plainest of names. She recounted incantations for the apprentices, her tone careful, skeptical of even the most innocent forgetfulness. Her fear grew not of war, but of blankness, children who could recite a king's name but stumbled at the harvest hymn, who mimicked foreign melodies when their own were easier forgotten. She understood then, conquest might not always come with blades, but with the silent lapses within. Sometimes, beneath a spreading fig, Akpata would find herself surrounded by children staring with mute expectation, uneasy at the stories they half heard, half doubted. The silences between her words lengthened. She realized that less and less was truly known, more and more assumed. She mourned quietly as Effensetten faded from this world, her teacher's stories dissolving like footprints in rain. Yet Akpata persisted, compelled by duty to speak against oblivion. In her rare moments alone, among the relics, in the moonlit hush of ancestral chambers, she whispered the genealogies. She let her own hand seek out the rough carvings on the palace walls, letting each groove remind her of a tale every ancestor assumed would always be told. She sang to the places where silence grew thick, refusing to let it settle into finality. Thus, the siege of silence pressed tighter, unannounced and patient. Akpata, alone now among echoes, recognized the enormity of what she guarded. Not simply stories, but the right to remember, the courage to speak when all that surrounded her beckoned toward forgetting. Her voice was smaller, perhaps, than the sweep of events. But in that soft resistance, the pulse of Dahomey endured a while longer, unbroken in the hush between storms. With Effensetten's passing, the palace echoed differently. Intervals between drumbeats stretched wider, and for a time, Akpata moved through each day encased in that hollowness. Yet beneath the hush, something unexpected began to coalesce. Within the cracks left by silence, the muffled promise of defiance gathered with the insistence of a half-remembered song. Outside the royal walls, Dahomey's pulse grew more erratic, rumor and resolve weaving a secret counterpoint to official fear. It was the women who gathered first. In corners of the market, by moonlight beside the heatless brick kilns, voices whispered resolve. Among the Eggengun dancers and midwives, word traveled, quietly but unbroken. Akpata was drawn to these gatherings, not as a leader, but as witness, watcher, and reluctant confessor. The air at these meetings trembled with more than sorrow. It vibrated with a determination that skirted the edges of open rebellion. There, among the daughters of Dahomey's famed warriors, the women who remembered bloodlines like prayers, Akpata found herself a vessel among vessels. Each woman threaded her story into the dusk, how she had outweighted hunger, how she mended nets woven and rewoven after loss. Laughter was sharper here, so too was the aftertaste of rage. These moments, so unlike the sanctioned rituals of palace and festival, kindled something ungovernable. Even those too young to recall the height of Dahome's glory lingered, curious and emboldened as the night deepened. As Akpada listened, she realized how the soundscape of the kingdom was changing. New rhythms pounded after sunset, furtive drums, syncopations alien to the old regalia, but unmistakably rooted in a fierce hope. Songs arose that mocked the foreign invaders, ridiculed the king's indecision, or whispered riddles only the brave dared answer aloud. An undercurrent of power flowed through these refrains, an insistence that, even when every edict demanded silence, the people would improvise their remembering. The griot's ancient task, the shepherding of memory, shifted from comfort to confrontation. Akpata's role bent to the moment. She withdrew from the thinning ritual pageants, spending more hours outside the palace, learning not only what should be preserved, but what must now be transformed. As the threat darkened, she wove rebellion into her stories, sometimes openly, sometimes through metaphor or sly inflection. A tale that once traced the feats of King Agaja now coursed with double meaning, his struggles mirrored in the kingdom's imminent peril, his victories shaded by warnings of overconfidence and pride. Young apprentices, orphaned by violence or the slow erasure of tradition, became her shadow. She taught them to listen for coded warnings, to capture not only the overt accounts, but also the silence that signified danger or agreement. In private, they practiced refrains that could be disguised as work songs, signaling hope or distress under the ears of unfriendly neighbors. Each line she passed to them flickered with risk, yet the necessity was plain. It was better for memory to survive, fractured and reinterpreted, than be lost entire. Amid these lessons, Akpada felt rebellion vibrating in the marrow of daily life. There was rebellion in the measured gaze of a trader who shortchanged the new taxman, in the slow, deliberate planting of a plot that would not be tithed, in the gestures mothers traced on their children's skin before sleep. Even the palace's rigid ceremonial meal took on sly new cadences. Platters passed in patterns recalling ancient battle signals, a silent game of courage played with those who remembered. Yet this defiance was not loud. Its brilliance lay in its persistence. The drum that summoned no one, and yet was never stilled. The woman who sang forbidden verses while appearing to rock her infant. The stories twisted into forms robust enough to elude censure, but pointed enough to anchor collective will. Akpada understood more deeply than before that resistance was a language as supple as any epic, one the oppressors would never fully translate. At night, in the scant privacy of her sleeping mat, she felt the stories burning. She replayed the words of her ancestors, adjusting their cadence to suit this new terrain. Her personal grief, Effenseten's absence, the thinning rows of elders became fuel. By moonlight, she scrawled lines for songs that would travel far beyond her voice, lines meant to be recited in fields, on wharves, and in the fevered quiet of hiding places. Each word a heartseed, planted in hopes of stubborn spring. As the palace endured its uneasy stasis, the kingdom's real memory moved elsewhere, through alleyways, down rivers. Inside the chest of every child willing to hum a tune, their mother warned them never to sing aloud. Akpada, now a solitary witness at ceremonial gatherings, noticed how the official rites rang hollow. Yet she drew strength from those who walked the city's margins, unwilling to let the music die. Rebellion, she saw, was not always a trumpet blast. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to forget, the unbroken pulse tucked between despair and dawn. In this, she recognized herself, not simply the court's last griot, but a living echo of the people's right to endure. As seasons wheeled onward, the shape of Dahome's days became a puzzle of absences and cautious renewal. What had once seemed immutable, the shadow of the palace over the marketplace, the resonance of ancient drums, now appeared softened, imperfections showing through the lacquer of ceremony. The old walls, though pitted by age and silent witness to foreign incursions, stood in shades, neither wholly proud nor entirely broken. Akpata, in her passing years, learned to see them not merely as relics, but as thresholds, portals opening between what Dahomey remembered, what it risked forgetting, and what it might yet become. With the king's power lessening in each negotiation, his gestures grew more symbolic, his words stirring frustration rather than reassurance. Even so, the network of memory enmeshed beneath his rule persisted. A labyrinth of hidden songs, broken proverbs, and reconciled estrangements that ran far deeper than any royal edict. Akpata understood now the deeper paradox of her vocation. The griot's charge was never the simple recitation of a fixed, unyielding truth. Instead, her life became the careful balancing of loyalty and adaptation, inheritance and improvisation, solitude and communion. Efensetin's death, though it had left a hollow, seeded new forms of practice. Young ones, adolescents with uncertain steps, faces still half-shadowed by childish impulse, sought out Akpata as dusk curled around the city. They arrived at her door under the guise of errand or curiosity, lingering as she wrote or hummed, hungry for both overt instruction and secrets embedded within hesitation. She did not greet them as a teacher, but as a fellow traveler, a provisional witness to the kingdom's unfinished epic. She taught differently now. Instead of painstaking fidelity to the old syllables, she encouraged her listeners to wrestle with ambiguity. If you do not know a detail, shape the story until it fits the world in front of you, she would say, her voice neither resigned nor dismissive. But never shape it so much that you cannot recognize yourself in it. The kingdom's legacy, she explained, was neither ossified recitation nor reckless reinvention. Each telling, each song, was today's negotiation between the birthright of memory and the hunger of the future. Beneath the slow-footed pace of daily life, traces of change threaded through everything. Traders in new garb offered coins etched with foreign faces, yet the women of the market still bartered with phrases rooted in the time before invasion. The palace's rituals condensed, sometimes observed in token only, but at night in distant compounds where foreign ears seldom listened. Old choruses surfaced again, laughter and mourning mingling in private tribute. Akpata's apprentices wandered these spaces, not as keepers of dry record, but as living links in a chain neither broken nor fully visible. One evening, as the rains returned, she accompanied them to a festival outside Abame's battered gates. The air shimmered with harmattan, infusing the atmosphere with both hope and resignation. In a circle lit by smoldering lamps, children and elders exchanged stories. For a moment, distinction between them vanished. Akpata witnessed a refrain first sung in her youth rising again, inflected with new meaning. Old grievances turned sly, illusions reshaped by those who now bore the tale. She watched as faces brightened, even as their joy was laced with uncertainty. It was here, in this communion, that Akpata saw the essence of endurance. She thought of the myriad voices once entrusted to her, those who had vanished under the grinding advance of empire, those lost in famine, those reduced to half-remembered whispers. She felt herself, for the first time, both the inheritor and the bequest, not the absolute safeguard of the past, but its advocate within the perpetual struggle of memory. The role of the griot, she realized, was not to outlast history, but to seed resilience in those who would follow, even if her own footsteps would wash away with the coming storm. As her hair silvered, Akpata's own presence in the palace diminished. She found herself more at ease in the open air, trading wisdom for seeds, fables for laughter. Her stories, once strictly curated, now tumbled forth more freely. She collaborated with dancers and women skilled in textiles, weaving songs into cloth. She encouraged children to invent their own myths, to test, to contradict, to remember and revise. Where silence had once threatened to obliterate, now blossomed a restless, evolving chorus. Foreigners continued to arrive, sometimes bearing gifts meant to impress, sometimes with offers shadowed by calculation. But Akpata welcomed them as an audience, not to flatter or appease, but to teach the paradoxes of her people. In her tales, Dahomey was never wholly victim, never wholly victor, a land where defiance and adaptation intertwined, where memory refused to harden into bitterness, where the griot spirit invited listeners to linger, question, and ultimately embrace uncertainty. On her final day as twilight gathered, Akpata sat with an apprentice beneath a kapok tree. The hush no longer laced with oppression, but ripened by all it had endured. The young one asked what it meant to be a griot when the world itself would not yield to remembering. Akpata smiled, hand lifted to catch the drifting pulse of breeze. To be a griot is not only to speak, she began, her voice thin, burnished, yet unwavering, but to listen for the questions the world is not yet ready to answer. As daylight slid down the ancient trunks, the kingdom's last griot watched her apprentice lean into the silence, not as defeat, but as invitation. Around them, the world waited, not for a single tale, fixed or whole, but for the next echo, stumbling and radiant, to begin anew. On the gentle slope, just beyond the steely fields of Aksum, before the unblinking watch of black granite monoliths and the silent congregation of ancient stones, the morning broke with a cool hush. The city itself, rising in terraces of mudbrick and basalt, crackled quietly to restless life as the sky uncurled its pale blue banners. It was here, in the shadow of vanished queens and lost kings, that Selam walked barefoot and carefully toward the royal scriptorium, an apprentice among seasoned scribes, her mind as bright and taut as new parchment. Inside the dim scriptorium, dust laced with frankincense drifted lazily across thin shafts of light, illumining flecks of color in the robes of stooped elders who pressed reeds to vellum. With a patience that seemed to slow time itself, there was an order to the place, a discipline as rigid and precise as the grid lines faintly traced on the countless folios awaiting their prayers, their records, their chronicles. Selam's task was not yet the high calling of gospel copying. For months, she had ground indigo and lapis into ink, trimmed quills with an obsidian knife, and swept the stone floors clean of errant sand. But each day her eyes drank the silent ballet, the slow curling of Guillet's letters, the sacred drama of word, ink, meaning. Her master, Abba Tesfaye, was a scholar whose hair had gone moon-white with years bent over secrets. He rarely spoke above a whisper. Yet in Selam's memory, every phrase gleamed like gold. To write is to tether memory, he would say, the tip of his finger hovering over a manuscript's margin, as if touching the river of time itself. The future dwells in these lines, child, for all that survives the tongue must find a home on skin. One afternoon, when the sun outside lay flattened across the distant fields, and the scriptoria's dry quiet had settled into every pore, Abba Tesfaye summoned Selam to a corner table. There, stacked among crumbling sheets rescued from monsoons and rats, was a palimpsest, a folio scraped and rewritten, its surface bearing the ghostly impress of two histories overlain. He slid it toward her, the barest twinkle in his eye betraying the gravity of the moment. "Read not only what is obvious," he murmured, gesturing over the uneven letter forms. "Beneath every word stands another. Our kingdom's memory is layered, Selam, as is the faith we claim and the lands we walk." Selam bent close, the bitter scent of vellum filling her nose, the warmth of years radiating from the worn hide. The upper text, a liturgical hymn in careful black ink, traced the praises of Izana, the king who brought the cross to the empire, and made the faith a river flowing at the heart of Aksumite life. But beneath, smudged, almost spectral, she glimpsed strokes of a different hand. Sharper, older, letters crowding the margins, almost erupting where erasure had failed. The sensation that followed mingled awe and a note of dread. It was as if the very stones beneath her feet understood more than they let on. As if the past, impatient at being buried, pressed against the thin skin of parchment and silence, pleading not to be forgotten. For that moment, Selam felt herself watched by centuries, her own breath sounding loud and thin in the hush. She dared to whisper, "What is it?" Abba Tesfaye did not reply, but the pause in his silence felt deliberate, a page not yet turned. He let her sit with the question, the palimpsest and its haunted undertext between her hands, as the sun's rays drew slow lines on the stone floor. For the first time, she realized, to be a scribe was not only to preserve, but to uncover. The ink carried more than meaning. It bore longing, grief, 1,000 vanished voices, waiting for the gentle patience of decipherment. Outside, dusk grew thick and amber. Within Selam, something quickened, a restless, wordless yearning. The day's copying resumed, but her gaze flickered often to the palimpsest, its unreadable scars promising buried rivers of history. In the low light of the scriptorium, ink bled quietly into memory. Selam's hands trembled not with fatigue, but with the sense of threshold, a secret learned, but not yet named. Dawn unfurled cool and green across the upland terraces, gilding the acacia leaves as Selam descended, manuscript bundle pressed lightly to her chest. The river that skirted Aksum's edge gurgled unseen behind mango groves, threading the city's waking streets with the reminder of ceaseless movement. A current not unlike history, both nourishing and erasing. The scriptorium, already thick with the muted shuffle of parchment and the rhythmic sigh of pens, felt full of purpose and burden. Outside the walls, merchants from Adulize were arriving, their camels heavy with glass beads, frankincense, and Roman silver, faint, foreign scents clinging to their clothes and words. Trade had shaped this city as surely as the rain shaped stone. The Red Sea's pulse, bringing distant thoughts and hidden dangers alike. At times, Selim felt the city's breath in her own bones, the mingling of the world's hunger and beauty, agreements made and broken. The fragile thread of peace, maintained in part by the invisible work of scribes, documenting ledgers, edicts, and foreign correspondence. Selim's hands, once clumsy with inexperience, now moved with subtle certainty, guiding the brush of ink over the palimpsest's roughened skin. The undertext called to her in the hush between lessons, a fragment warped by the passage of time, but distinctly not the piety of the surface script. She glimpsed names unfamiliar, half-formed references to distant cities, and what sounded like a migration, echoes of lives ferried by salt wind and open water. There was a recurring phrase, "The sea's laughter is memory." It surfaced amid the older text again and again, like a line of song. Selim wondered what hand had conjured these words, and what grief or joy clung to them. Was it a record of arrival, or a lament for worlds left behind? She looked up often, gaze skimming the room's sun-faded walls, as if by some trick of light she might spy the vanished scribe who had set it down. At midday, while the scriptorium emptied for the bread and water of the communal table, Selim lingered under the high window. Below, the city's hum rose and fell with the rhythm of a reed flute. She imagined the Red Sea not as the distant border of empire, but as a vein, alive, trembling beneath the surface of every market cry, and every prayer whispered at night. Abba Tesfaye visited her solitude with a question, gentle yet precise. "Do you ever dream, Selim, of what lies beyond these hills?" His eyes, accustomed to the microcosm of script, harbored something larger, an unrecorded history, perhaps, or the secret sorrow of knowledge. She hesitated before answering. In dreams, the world bent and widened, a tapestry unrolling beyond the boundary stones of Aksum. She saw ships, reed, wood, or some impossible silver, riding restless waters. She felt heat and brine, the ache of separation and the hope of return. "I dream I am both lost and returning," she whispered. He nodded, satisfied. "Even stone remembers salt," he said, and gave a rare, thin smile as he drifted away. That evening, after the sun had melted over the horizon, and the stones of Aksum glowed with afterlight, Selim returned to the palimpsest. The room was nearly dark, save for a lamp that scored long, honeyed shadows across her work. She ground more ink, tracing each layered word and pondering the purpose behind the erasure, the act of overwriting as both violence and preservation. Did the scribe fear the knowledge within, or simply serve another master who demanded new truths? The words of the undertext grew almost audible, shaped by the steady salt breeze that sometimes curled through open slats. In its half-legible confession, Selim heard echoes of sailors and wanderers, the hiss of surf, and the distant clangor of foreign tongues brought to safe harbor. She copied line by line, committing not only to ink, but to memory. History, she realized, was never the smooth chronicle the elders recited. It was as tumultuous and contradictory as the sea herself, with voices rising then sinking, swept by tempest and yearning. The lamp's glow shivered against the parchment, mirroring the movement of tides themselves, restless, persistent, impossible to wholly confine. In the hush, Selim felt a quiet expansion, her task no longer just devotion, but deep nourishment of the soul. She belonged to Aksum, its memory, its commerce, and its dreaming. And yet, through the palimpsest's haunted script, she was carried outward, always returning with new echoes billowing dimly in the interstices of ink and silence. The heat came early that week, dense and unnerving, pressing the scriptorium's breath against rough-hewn beams and turning the city air to a wavering glass. Even the ancient cypresses in the palace courtyards seemed subdued, their limbs dipping lazily, shadows twisting across the marble. In that stagnant stillness, news moved in sharp, unexpected currents. A border skirmish in the north, priests quarreling about heresy and orthodoxy, and strangers rumored in the markets, their accents unplaceable, their intent uncertain. Selam immersed herself in labor, copying tractates with the calm focus of one warding off anxiety. Yet beneath her fingertips, the palimpsest's undertext grew troubling. The more she uncovered, the more ambiguous its character seemed. There were records of negotiations, not simply prayers, but warnings, lists of grievances, letters to unnamed rulers across the water. The words bore sharp edges, phrases of dissent, the tremors of contested faith. At night, her dreams flickered with indistinct voices arguing in humid, lamplit chambers, the sea hissing ceaselessly beyond stone walls. The library, too, felt changed. Scents of hot dust and singed papyrus settled over the bookshelves, as if the air itself remembered old disaster. Whispers lingered at the threshold, of Aryan texts hidden in secret alcoves, of edicts drafted in haste, of archives threatened by imperial decree. Selam overheard older scribes muttering about the new eparch's suspicions, his desire to purify, to erase impurity, and unify Aksum's heart beneath a single doctrine. For the first time, she noticed the nervous, darting glances exchanged over ink pots, the way hands folded manuscripts to hide controversial passages. One evening, a summons pulsed through the scriptorium. The new eparch and his attendants entered, their presence slicing the familiar dimness with bright, hard edges. Their voices were measured, cloaked in ceremonial gravity. "There are scrolls here with poison in their marrow," the eparch announced, standing where the lamp threw no shadow. Aksum must endure unsullied. Old doubts must burn. The senior scribes complied without protest. Scrolls long untouched were gathered. Works by exiled scholars, chronicles that dared too much honesty, commentaries shaped in a different dialect. Selam helped, her hands trembling not from fear of punishment, but from something subtler, the grief that arrives when forgetting is made deliberate, irrefutable. Piles of brittle parchment grew at the courtyard's edge, their fate sealed by those who deemed memory dangerous. Flames, red, muscular, insensitive, devoured the first manuscripts, licking up centuries, scattering histories as smoke and grayed fragments into the settling dusk. Selam tried not to watch, but even turned away. Her mind's eye saw the burning, the slow curling of ink, the voices of the dead hurrying skyward, disordered and unfinished. Each gust of wind over the city carried a fresh bitterness, a sharp, hollowed absence. She found herself beside Abba Tesfaye, who rested a consoling hand on her shoulder even as his own face, usually so composed, trembled with contained sorrow. His whisper came as a benediction and a warning. "We keep alive what we can, Selam, but all that burns remains in the heart longer than the ash." Something in his tone suggested he had witnessed such scenes before, perhaps in the earliest violence of conversion, perhaps even further back in time's coil, when memory was transferred from voice to script for fear of vanishing altogether. When night finally settled and the courtyards emptied of both fire and fury, Selim crept back into the archive, seeking solace among the shelves stripped bare. She pressed the palimpsest to her body, a shield, a promise, tracing its layers with soft, uncertain fingers. In the darkness, she no longer distinguished between what was preserved and what had slipped away, between the histories voiced and those silenced by conflagration. All of it circled within her, the faith that endures, the doubts that flicker, and the burden of words left unsaid. From that moment, as the last embers withered into cold ash outside, a deeper resolve formed in her. Aksum's heritage could not be preserved by ink alone. It would require subtlety, secrecy, and the courage to remember even when commanded to forget. The palimpsest, now her most sacred trust, still bore its restless shadows, waiting to speak for those the flames had erased. In Selim, memory would not burn. It would survive, smoldering quietly, ready to rise again when the world allowed. The rains returned in a hush, cautious and deliberate, drawing a veil of silver over Aksum's battered rooftops. Where the sky had flung down dust and fire, now came the steady prayer of water, pocking shallow pools across the gardens and darkening the palace stone to a quiet gleam. Selim moved through this softened world with a new inwardness, her steps calculated to avoid the gaze of authority, her thoughts disguised behind the practiced reserve of a dutiful apprentice. In the scriptorium, time seemed to thicken. Shadows settled in the corners, muffling the world to a tapestry of whispers and the faint, persistent scrape of reed pens. The elders spoke less now, sentences clipped to essentials, as if even their words risked accusation. Papers were folded more carefully, ink pots hidden beneath cloth, and glances exchanged only in passing. The aftermath of the burning hung over each lesson, unspoken but unbudgeable, and Selim felt its pressure in her chest with every careful copy she made. She preserved the palimpsest as one tends a fragile lamp, shielded from suspicion, hidden among innocuous devotional scrolls. Its undertext, the lost and layered histories, had become the architecture of her solitude. Some evenings, she retreated to the cloistered shadows beneath the portico, unfolding the page in the dimming light, letting her eye drift over the half-obliterated script. Each stroke felt like a breath drawn long ago, each erased word a secret mirrored in her own heart. What survived beneath the new writing grew sharper. She began to piece together an account unlike the chronicles preserved in the emperor's vaults: stolen negotiations with Nubian envoys, burial rites for a faith older than the New Cross, the names of women healers and sea captains absent from the official annals. The echo of those voices did not fade. Rather, they seemed to root Selim more deeply in her homeland, revealing an Aksum built as much upon silence as proclamation. History, she realized, was not only what was spoken, but all that had been unsaid in the presence of power. One afternoon, as rain beat gently against the latticed windows, Abba Tesfaye beckoned her aside. His muteness since the burning had grown stony, yet now his eyes fixed her with deliberate intent. "When a word cannot be written," he said, voice no louder than the rain, "it must be kept another way. Some stories, Selim, are born in the turn of the hand, the bend of prayer, the patience of the watcher who endures." He pressed her palm, a subtle gesture, the sharing of a trust that could not be seized or catalogued. Selim understood. The palimpsest was more than a document. It was a threshold, an inheritance that passed from living keeper to silent heir, multiplying not through multiplication, but through memory's discreet fidelity. So much of Aksum's life, rituals lived in twilight, alliances whispered by moonlight, persisted because a few chose to tend the flame in darkness, refusing the obliteration of easy answers. Selim grew expert in the language of omission. She learned to leave spaces in the margins of official scrolls, to nestle a mark or a curve where only the canny would look for meaning. Her hand developed new habits, embedding echoes of the forbidden beneath gospel and decree, a script within a script, a trace too soft for the eye of power. In this, she was never truly alone. Walking the raining streets, she sometimes glimpsed others, elders, merchants, the weathered widow at the gate, whose gestures were studded with the weight of concealed truths, whose silence curled around her own. Outside, Aksum resumed its semblance of order, repaired its walls, welcomed new traders beneath banners bright with swelling figs and saffron. Yet beneath the laughter and daily commerce, the city harbored its wounds. In the evenings, lullabies drifted on the moist air, carrying older inflections, a melody, a phrase, a rhythm unrecorded but deeply known. Through it all, Selim pressed on, her devotion now doubled by necessity. She watched, listened, and quietly transcribed remembrance, where none but the future reader might discern the shape of her intention. In those damp and shadowed days, she understood what it meant to be more than a scribe. She became a vessel, a carrier of what must not die. For every word that passed her lips or pen, another was held in reserve, circulating unseen. If ink could be erased and voices silenced, then memory would survive seed-like, trapped between the pulse of her heart and the vigilance of her eye. The city endured. The chronicles above and below the surface survived together, one spoken, one silent, both woven tightly now into Selim's living care. The season of abundance crept quietly over Aksum. The air, lately silvered by rain, now carried the warmth of ripening grain and the subtle perfume of jasmine unfurling at dawn. Traders drifted inland with bundles of silk and carnelian, while caravans laden with salt wound toward the distant south. Even the cicadas in the acacia trees seemed to chant of renewal. And yet, beneath this shared prosperity, Selim felt the weight of time gathering itself for parting. Years had passed since flame and decree had tried to thin the city's memory. Scribes came and went, their apprenticeships ending in placement or departure, and Abba Tesfaye grew stooped, his hands stiffening, his voice, a low wind in the silent hour, becoming more rarely heard. Despite frailty, he lingered at her side, guiding Selim through the labyrinth of scripture and legend, until wisdom was gently transposed, like soft light filtered through parchment. From master to disciple, Selim now stood as the chief scribe, her posture more assured, her fingertips bearing the faint stains of 1,000 days' labor. She tended the scriptorium with an almost maternal vigilance, balancing the court's need for official memory against the deeper, quiet charge of preservation. The palimpsest remained concealed, but its influence grew like an invisible root, feeding the foundation of her practice. The art of concealment had evolved. Sacred truths and forbidden histories trickled subtly into new margins, transforming the unspoken into a subtle pattern understood by those with patience and longing for what once was. At times, she watched the children of the palace as they ran through the porticos, their laughter carrying in the morning's forgiving air. More than once, she caught a pause in their play, a curious gaze held on the glyphs she traced in her lap, the beginning of a question, a seed of wonder waiting to take root. Selim recognized herself in those glances, the same hunger for meaning denied and rediscovered, forming the secret mortar of any enduring civilization. Recognition came in other forms, quiet notes left by merchants whose family lore stretched beyond the Red Sea, discreet acknowledgments from healers and travelers, older than the newest edicts. Aksum, Selim sensed, would persist as long as stories continued their restless migration from ear to ear and heart to heart, even when ink and papyrus failed. In her twilight hours, Selim returned anew to the palimpsest. She had begun, painstakingly, to transcribe its undertext into a cipher of her own making, an embroidery of signs and silences, carefully woven between hymns and royal decrees. Her script sang a legacy for those not yet born, a hush within the official record, unmistakable to the attuned. Each session carried the feeling of ritual, a breath drawn in, a line committed, a memory sent into the thicket of time. She was not alone in this work. A clandestine kinship had grown among those who read and wrote beyond the mandates of governance, scribes, washerwomen, retired soldiers, even children learning to shape their first letters. The city's unwritten chronicle bloomed underground, resilient in the face of renewal, touched by laughter and lament in equal measure. Sometimes, in the candlelit hours before dawn, Selim would sit with another across low tables, reciting secret lines and pausing, listening to the city's sleeping heart. When Abba Tesfaye's passing approached, the scriptorium fell into a hush so profound that the scratching of pens sounded thunderous beside the old man's failing breaths. On his final morning, Selim attended him as he gazed softly at the lintel shadow, a reverence in his regard akin to farewell. "Keep watch," he murmured, "not only over lines but over souls. What is lost to fire or time lives in the vigil of those who care." The last scribe's legacy did not reside only in parchment or practiced hand. It pulsed in the resolve to remember as an act of witness. As the days pressed on, Selim found herself the seam between eras, bearing the knowledge that history is forever shifting, a tapestry unfinished, yet luminous wherever light finds thread. She walked, sometimes slowly, among the stelae and gardens, sensing how Aksum's essence was held not in monuments, but in a community of guardians invisible to the passing world. The years gathered in silence. Sometimes, new novices came seeking entrance, their hopes packed in whispers and their fingers trembling at the touch of the first quill. Selim guided them gently, teaching patience and vigilance, offering the lesson that true memory is woven from both what is recorded and all that is quietly cherished. The palimpsest waited, a cipher for those to come, an inheritance far stronger than stone or decree. So endured the memory of Aksum, luminous in the shadowed hands of its last scribe, scattered like seeds on the wind for another season's harvest, in ink, in silence, in candlelight, and in the hush of hearts listening for forgotten names. The story pressed onward, unseen, undying, in the quiet legacy that outlasts both keeper and king. The city of Edo, vast and humming at the close of the 18th century, drew breath between the weight of its traditions and the restless wind of change. Each morning, amber sunlight slipped through clouds of wood smoke to touch the latticework of tea houses and the endless lines of tile-roofed dwellings. Merchants bellowed out prices across market lanes laden with lacquer and silks, while cherry trees bent heavy with their first blushing blooms. In this city, a mosaic of artisans and wanderers, stood a house of quiet repute, the workshop of Nakamoto Sora, the last great kintsugi master of a dwindling age. Aya, his daughter, was not the first of her blood to bow before the kiln, nor the first to cup her hands around the chill fragments of pottery, but she would be the last. The kiln's fire, once fed by many, now belonged to her slender hands alone. Even now, as her father watched from the shadows of the antechamber, she listened for the gentle sigh that porcelain released when it remembered the touch of flame, and coaxed golden lacquer across a shattered bowl, as if encouraging a wounded thing back to song. The neighbors knew to tread softly past the Nakamoto compound, their voices shrinking as the wind carried hints of pine resin and the metallic tang of Yurushi sap. Aya's world was not one of clamor, but constraint, a hush broken only by the crackle of embers and the sharp brush of her tools. Within those walls lingered the scent of old secrets and family grief. Her mother's low, clear laughter haunted the corridor corners, lost to childbirth winters ago, and her father's presence wavered between stern pride and silent mourning, for traditions no longer cherished outside their gates. Edo itself pressed close, relentless and curious. Apprentices from distant provinces jostled for space with foreign traders near the Sumida River, each bearing tales of porcelain from distant Jingdezhen, stories of European traders whispering about glass that would never break, about gold that lay not in cracks, but in vaults. Once, the lacquered bowls mended by Nakamoto hands found their place on the tables of daimyo and tea monks, each fracture honored, each seam threaded with gold and history. Now commissions dwindled, and the city's mood soured toward the old ways, impatient as a river after the ice thaws. Amidst this, Aya persisted. She swept the floor as her elders had, but her effort was made heavier by the sharpening doubts in the eyes of the city and the stubborn reticence of her own blood. The last three masters in the neighborhood, gray-browed, wary, and knotted by the politics of lineage, refused to share the final, most delicate forms of their craft. Aya's requests for guidance were met with silence or brusque turns of the wrist. Her borrowed bowls returned untouched from the fires of their kilns. Her own father, drawn deeper into reverie and regret, spoke less often, his voice dwindling each season as if words, too, were a form of gold that must be sparingly employed, lest tradition run dry. Still, Aya refused despair, for the kiln must remain fed, and the art, her inheritance, could not vanish so quietly. Nights stretched long in the Nakamoto house, each hour marked by her own relentless study as she pieced together failed joins and mapped invisible forces across grains of porcelain. She learned to read the fissures left by time. A tea bowl shattered in the heat of summer, a sake cup split on the floor after a moment of laughter and loss. Each fault spoke its own language, and Aya listened as if the cracks might utter the last secrets that elders dared not give voice. Outside, the city swelled and receded in waves, carrying lantern festivals, samurai processions, and the muffled cries of vendors hawking wares in the moonless dark. But within this enclave of shadow and amber heat, Aya kindled her resolve. Firelight gilded the scars of pottery arrayed about her, each a testament to rupture and to beauty found not in flawlessness, but in the embrace of imperfection. There, amid the gentle groans of cooling clay and the slow beat of her heart, the flame's soft roar rejoined her, silent, patient, awaiting the moment when a fractured world might yet be made whole again. In the earliest hour, when Edo's breath had not yet stirred the mist from the river, and all living things seemed in a fitful half-sleep, Aya often wandered the periphery of her father's compound, hands abraded by practice, mind lit with restless recollection. It was in these pale moments, when the city's tumult was held at bay, sequestered behind draped screens and shuttered doors, that the pulse of memory grew clearest, as if the past lingered behind every crack and plaster, every knotted root pushing up beneath flagstones trodden by generations. Memory for Aya was not so much a succession of images as the texture of things handled and repaired. She had, as a child, fingered the lacquered bowl that had served 3 generations, her mother's gentle hands polishing it at twilight, her father's solemn voice tracing the line of gold that wound through its center like a pathway lost among mountains. The bowl had once shattered in a quarrel, though Aya only knew the story secondhand, a discord of raised voices, the hush that followed, her mother's quiet weeping in a garden of dewy chrysanthemum. Yet it had returned from the kiln reborn, radiant with light caught in every fault, its story never far from her thoughts. Thus, Kintsugi had always offered her a language richer than spoken words, a conversation with the unseen, the half-remembered. Each join she attempted was a fragile negotiation, not simply a union of ceramic and seam, but an offering to time, an insistence that even endings might be honored. In those gold veins that laced the bowls in her father's alcove, Aya read the names of those departed, her mother's laughter, her grandfather's rare approval, apprentices who had drifted away like mist before the summer's heat. She could not recall their faces entire, only the warmth that once filled the room with possibility. Yet memory, like lacquer, could be treacherous. The more Aya pursued it, the more she sensed the spaces between recollections, gaps as irregular as splinters in a rice paper door. There were days when the silence from her father gathered weight. His hands, now trembling, hovered above her work, not in correction, but in a hush that threatened reprimand. She yearned for words of encouragement, but his eyes, clouded by winters of regret and self-doubt, seemed always turned inward. The world beyond the compound's walls was louder now, a world where artistry was measured in coins and novelty, where cracks were hidden or discarded, not adorned with gold. In response, Aya resolved to make the kiln's hearth an altar to memory, feeding it not merely the splintered bowls gathered from the market, but tokens of the Nakamoto line's own history. She unearthed a cup that had belonged to her mother, dull and chipped at the rim, its base marked by initials in an ink faded nearly away. Turning it in her hands, she recalled her mother's teasing stories about the distant mountains of her childhood, a world so far removed from Edo's surge, and scatter that it felt like a memory borrowed from someone else's dream. Preparation for mending such a cherished piece was painstaking. Aya measured the lacquer with a reverence bordering on prayer. She ground pine soot and mixed it with the sap, the scent sharp in her nostrils, recalling incense offered for the dead. Her tools, inherited from ancestors she'd known only as brushstrokes in old paintings, felt heavy with import. As she guided the fine brush along the torn edge of the porcelain, the air filled with anticipation, a ritual not for display, but for continuity. As dawn arrived and city birds began their tentative song, Aya placed the cup near the fire to cure, watching the new seam glimmer with hesitant promise. It dawned on her that memory was not simply a burden to be borne. It was a thread, the very gold thread, that tied her life to those who had shaped her, and to the art that might yet persist when the world's gaze turned away. Outside, the first stirrings of the day grew louder, the staggered clatter of cart wheels, the echo of footfalls over damp stones. Soon, city folk would awaken to new concerns. Traders would bicker over price, and artisans would coax brief beauty from wood and clay. But within the Nakamoto household, Aya girded herself with the hush of memories, her certainty deepening. Every piece she restored was more than an object returned to usefulness. It was a pledge that fracture, loss, and longing could be made not invisible, but precious. A gold thread binding past to present, and a slender hope holding open the future. Rain fell in patterns gentle and persistent, threading the alleys between merchant stalls and pooling in the worn indentations of bridge stones. At the hour when lanterns began to flicker awake, Aya stood at the threshold of her father's workshop, watching the city ripple beneath the veils of rain. The streets wore a new hush, poured over with shadows, their clamor softened to a drumming that spoke of a world slowed and introspective. She had always cherished such nights, when the press of voices yielded to a quieter force, when every sound was reflected and made strange by water and memory. Within the sheltering gloom, Aya's work took on a different cadence. Her father's movements, already slow with age, became ever more spectral, drifting from brazier to wall without greeting. The rain outside summoned in him a peculiar unease, his features nodding into new reserve, his whispers directed more to ancestral spirits than to his watching daughter. Shadows, Aya thought, might stretch from distant generations, pooling now in the hollows of old houses and the furrows of gently trembling hands. Yet evening brought company rare and unsettling. Word had traveled from the riverside. A wealthy rice merchant, famed for his taste and his temper, sought the restoration of a tea set shattered during a gathering marred by sharp words and spilled secrets. Arriving beneath a waxed paper umbrella, the merchant's apprentice carried porcelain wrapped in indigo-dyed cloth, the shapes held with reverence and dread, as if the broken pieces might whisper betrayals. Yet Aya, ushering him into the gloom, felt the gulf between her silent world and the restless city widen. The air between customer and artisan was drawn tight with hesitations, as if the rain itself eavesdropped on every syllable. The porcelain, when revealed by lamplight, told its own story. Shards jagged, glaze fractured into web-like lines, residue of an old spill lingering at the rim with stubborn insistence. Aya ran a finger along the longest split, noticing how the merchant's apprentice watched, uncertain whether to pity or to challenge her craft. It was not an unfamiliar tension. Many in Edo doubted that Nakamoto hands could still conjure beauty from such ruin, especially now, as the city's desires lurched toward imported wonders and novelty for its own sake. But the prospect of a prominent commission left its own quiet throb of anxiety in Aya's chest. This restoration would not be hidden among family keepsakes. It would parade in parlors and gambling rooms, judged and whispered about beyond the boundaries of tradition. As she worked, the storm intensified, bringing with it a sense of time flexing in all directions. If morning's labors stretched forward, the night folded back, drawing reminders of days when the workshop bustled with activity, old apprentices swapping jokes, her mother humming a seasonal melody, hands deft and sure across mending seams. Now Aya toiled alone, rain pounding upon the tiles, the only constant, the kiln's breath and a memory of laughter. Each step lingered with meaning. With brush and gilded powder, she mapped out where gold might flow, a cartographer of broken places, tracing faded blue glazes as a river woman reads currents before embarking. The faintest tremor in her own hand betrayed both defiance and longing. To restore this tea set would mean more than earning the merchant's favor. It would be a declaration that the city, swollen with change, had not yet rendered the old ways obsolete. Her father emerged, silent at her side, his presence suddenly substantial and grave. He did not speak counsel or criticism. Instead, he watched as Aya prepared the first piece, his eyes drawn to the interplay of light upon clay, the faint shimmer where gold would soon be born. It occurred to Aya then that shadows, when cast across water, revealed not only darkness, but depths, layers of history, of loss, of potential passed wordlessly from parent to child. Hours passed as the rain softened its assault, drawing the world outward into gleaming clarity. Aya set the restored fragment before her, gold veining its surface with a confidence she had not known herself capable of. The piece was transformed, not into perfection, but into resilience. In the uncertain glow, father and daughter regarded one another, and in the quiet between them, the storm yielded to something wholly new, an understanding as fluid and undefinable as the river's surface at twilight, that endurance itself might be the rarest art. Beyond the compound, Edo returned to its nighttime murmurs. The festival banners along the canal danced on the wind. Lanterns drifted their reflections across rippling black water, shadows, gold, and memory interlaced. And within the old house, Aya let her breath fall into rhythm with the city's pulse, certain, for a moment, that as long as broken things could find their way back into light, all was not yet lost to the storm. The rains finally broke, leaving behind a city cleansed and reflective, every roof tile and lantern post shimmering beneath the pale, insistent sun. The world beyond the Nakamoto gate seemed, if only for an afternoon, utterly translucent, as if Edo itself had turned to glass. Aya, waking into this softened clarity, felt both exposed and newly seen, as though her own uncertainties had been scoured clean by the downpour. Since restoring the rice merchant's tea set, word had traveled through the winding gossip nets of the city's artisans. Nakamoto techniques might yet possess their old magic, and the kiln's silence was a cipher, not a tombstone. The consequence was sudden, a parade of visitors, bold and cautious alike. Some bore vessels chipped by misadventure, others fragments passed down like uncertain heirlooms. A former courtier arrived with a bowl said to have survived 3 fires. An apprentice potter from across the river proffered a broken sake flask, claiming it snapped the day his son was born. Their stories clung to the objects, sometimes more fiercely than to flesh and memory. Aya welcomed them with a humility grown substantial. Yet, as requests multiplied, so too did the subtle pressure, the sense that each piece summoned a different ghost to haunt her table. It was during this upwelling of work that another echo reached Aya, one not of clay or lacquer, but of glass. In the city's southern quarter, imported wares had begun to gather attention. Delicate European goblets, wine decanters of uncommon clarity and geometry, even a merchant's prized mirror that rendered a person's face with harsh, undisguised precision. The glass, though astonishing in artifice, was, by its nature, unbroken. "Perfect," whispered the onlookers. "Proof against the fates that shatter our own bowls and cups." Aya watched the fascination spread among Edo's young men and women, the admiration for these foreign things swelling with each festival. She observed their surface beauty, the absence of cracks or seams, and felt both wonder and displacement. What space was left for art that celebrated fracture and joining, when the city now longed for unmarked gloss, an allure that promised to erase the memory of loss altogether? She journeyed, one blue-skied morning, to the district where the new glassware was displayed. Rows of goblets and bottles caught the sun and threw hard, prismatic lines across the straw matting. Vendors, eager and boasting, lured buyers with tales of distant lands, cities even grander than Edo, where glass was made by fires older than any in Japan, where the kiln knew neither pause nor flaw. Aya, pale among the crowd, reached out to trace a finger over one crystalline rim, almost expecting it to yield or resist the way of ceramics. But it was cold, hard, and indifferent, refusing all invitation to reveal history's touch. That evening, as the city's glow returned to its warmer palette, Aya paced her workroom, the day's visions of flawless glass mingling with the steady accumulation of restored pottery. She set one bowl, newly mended, on her table beside a shard of imported crystal she had obtained as a curiosity. Under lamplight, the difference was stark. The patched vessel caught the light in uneven, shifting gold, each seam retelling disaster and repair. The glass fragment refracted brightness cleanly, without variance, as if to deny experience itself. Deep into the night, Aya mused over that contrast. Perfection, unmarked, unyielding, was alluring, but it also rang hollow, devoid of the intimacy a craftsman's hand invests in survival, in the gathering of what has been lost and found again. Even her father, haggard as he had become, watched her with new alertness as she pondered these dilemmas aloud. He did not give answers, but his eyes no longer retreated into the dusk. Instead, they reflected a kind of peace at witnessing his daughters reckoning with a world that wanted to trade story for surface. Over time, Aya's mending became less about technical mastery and more an act of translation. With each bowl, each cup returned from the brink of discard, she wrote a quiet retort to the city's infatuation. In gold, she set down reminders that fracture was not a taint, nor absence of worth, but a threshold across which memory marched, etched, luminous, profound. Her hands, grown sure and unhurried, worked into each repair not only the legacy of the Nakamoto, but her own voice, a joining of past and present into a seam that echoed, softly, against the glassy surface of a world determined to forget. So it was that even as the city's tastes in art and trade shifted, Aya became a keeper of echoes, her table an altar, her kiln a steady beacon for those who wished not to deny breakage, but to enshrine it. The reflections cast from her repaired wares grew slowly more sought, not for their flawlessness, but for their testimony. In every uneven golden line, Edo could read its own story, not one of unbroken glass, but of endurance, return, and the fragile beauty of all that survives. Quiet settled upon the Nakamoto house, but it was not the paralysis of neglect. Instead, it was the attentive calm of endurance. Time pressed on, indifferent yet subtly transformed. With each new commission, the workshop acquired a subtly changed rhythm. Paces measured between table, shelf, and kiln. The low chime of ceramic set upon wood, breathing in pace with the whir of the city just beyond the compound walls. The world outside spun ever faster, fashion swirling through the merchant districts, new words and manners trading hands as easily as coins. But within the workshop, Aya tended her flames with humility and patience. The glow of the coals steady in her care. Her father's presence became softer, yet somehow more lucid. He could now be found sitting for hours near the kiln's edge, his gaze not fixed on Aya's hands, but on some horizon only he could recognize. Where once he had faltered, a kind of trust had dawned, an unspoken surrender to his daughter's guardianship of their art. Occasionally, he might hum a line of a song once sung by Aya's mother, and the wistful rise and fall of melody would mingle with the chattering sparrows and the distant market's laughter. The echoes of their lineage, Aya now felt, ran through her like warmth follows a vein of gold. Aya moved among the objects entrusted to her, a parade of bowls and cups growing ever more motley as their stories multiplied. Some bore the marks of household calamity, others the slow corrosions of time or inheritance, some even arriving with the faint scent of salt from journeys by sea. A vessel, its lip chewed by years of imperfect storage, came with a letter pleading for the rescue of family unity. An incense box, warped by the fire it survived, was carried by a widow whose children had scattered. Each object was unique, its fracture a particular key to a quiet, unseen sorrow. And in mending them, Aya acknowledged not just their owners' stories, but her own limitations and hope. Together, Aya and her father prepared a final batch of yurushi, grinding, filtering, mixing with practiced care. She found, in these ordinary rituals, an answer to questions that glassware and shifting fortunes had never offered. Not perfection, not even permanence, but the beauty of care enacted again and again. The gold she pressed into seams did not erase pain, it illuminated it, rendering visible the journey from ruin to renewed purpose. She came to relish the moment when, after long hours, the lacquer dried and the gold's shimmer whispered to the new morning. The kiln's secret language flickering out one last truth, one afternoon, with spring at its tenderest. Aya was summoned to present her work before the city's assembly of artisans. It was less a contest than a ritual farewell. Whispers had begun, as always, about encroaching modernity, mass production, imported wares, painted porcelain shipped upriver bearing the mark of foreign kilns. The assembly was crowded with young craftsmen eager for the future, and older masters holding tight to their dwindling crafts. Aya presented a set of bowls restored with the utmost care, the gold running through their fissures, fine as calligraphy. While many admired them in silence, there was also a note of mourning for all that would soon vanish from Edo's waking life. The aftermath was not dramatic. There were no declarations of victory or bitter defeat. Instead, as the audience dispersed, an elder approached Aya, a rival once jealous of the Nakamoto technique, now stooped and threadbare. With a subtle bow, he praised the persistence she had shown, not in rivalry, but in faithfulness to her own path. "There is a glow," he said gently, not found in unbroken things. You have traced it well. When Aya returned home that night, dusk poured into the old house, softening every edge, the very walls seeming to yield and embrace the quiet thunder of irresolution. Her father knelt by the cold kiln as if to share its vigil, and Aya joined him. There were no words to fit the moment, only the rising scent of cedar, the gentle beat of her heart in time with his old and steady one. In that hush, the last kiln's glow lingered, catching in motes of dust, illuminating nothing and everything. The endings that are never complete, the traditions passed by touch more than tongue, the luminescence of survival in a world determined to move on. Thus the days continued, neither triumphant nor defeated. Aya remained at her window beside the kiln, receiving each vessel as if it were the first and last, finding in every line of gold not just evidence of endurance, but the promise that, somewhere within the ebb and flow of forgetting, memory could still be made visible, warm, and quietly eternal.